Britain's royal family likes to remind the public about how it stood with the nation during the Battle of Britain and visited homes that had been bombed out during the Blitz. But it's long been dogged by the actions of certain members of the royal family who were Nazi sympathisers. Most famously, King Edward VIII, who abdicated and went to Nazi Germany to meet Adolf Hitler. He also taught the Queen Mother how to give a Nazi salute in a photograph that was unearthed in the Royal Archives a few years back and published in The Sun. However, the story does not end there. Declassified has found another extraordinary photo of the royal family's ties to Nazis. This time it's King Charles, who received an honorary degree in the 1980s from a veteran of the Waffen-SS. To discuss this story, earlier I spoke to the freelance investigative journalist Hunter Pauley, who gave this story exclusively to Declassified. I started by asking Hunter about what Prince Charles had been doing visiting Canada in the 1980s.
He went on a royal tour across the country, and during that time he stopped off in the province of Alberta. He was with Princess Diana at the time, and actually spent her birthday there. And during the course of his stay in Alberta, he was granted an honorary law degree from the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta chancellor at the time was Peter Savaryn, a local political bigwig with the provincial Tory party, and also, it turns out, a veteran of the Waffen-SS.
Can you tell us what Peter Savaryn did during the Second World War?
So the Waffen-SS existed as kind of the armed paramilitary wing of the SS, which is the private army of the Nazi Party itself. It's distinct from the Wehrmacht, the German army, despite the fact that it did also have a combat role. The Waffen-SS was originally seen as kind of the Aryan elite of the Nazi military, but as the war went further and further south for the Germans, they started recruiting what are called Ostlegions, Eastern Legions, such as the 14th Waffen-SS Division Galicia. These were formed out of local collaborator groups in occupied Europe. The Waffen-SS Galicia Division was mostly destroyed during the Soviet reconquest of Western Ukraine in 1944 and was reconstituted with a number of other SS units and collaborator units with very bad reputations as the Nazis retreated out of Western Ukraine and deeper into Central Europe. It's at this time in 1944 that Savaryn joins the Waffen-SS Galicia Division, which is then sent to Yugoslavia to fight. It is sent to Slovakia to put down the uprising by patriots there, and then it is eventually sent to Austria, where it is holding the outskirts of Vienna as the Soviets advance on that city.
Although people like Savaryn like to portray themselves as Ukrainian nationalists who fought against Soviet occupation, the evidence that you found is actually he didn't fight to free Ukraine at all.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, he did not fight to free the nation of Ukraine from Soviet occupiers in any sense of the term. He fought to suppress the Yugoslav People's Army and partisans in Yugoslavia as they pushed the Nazis out of the country. He fought in Slovakia when the local military and German collaborators turned against the Germans. And then, even as he writes in his own book, he was defending the heart of the Third Reich on the outskirts of Vienna, and he ended the war by marching over the mountains into Bavaria. That's a long way from Ukraine at that point.
Many people watching this might be familiar with the scandal in the Canadian Parliament, where another veteran of this same unit, Jaroslav Hunka, was given a standing ovation by Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in a scandal that led to the resignation of the Speaker. And that incident led to some more much-needed scrutiny about this role of Waffen-SS veterans in Canadian society. Can you tell us about how you uncovered this particular evidence about Peter Savaryn?
In 2007, Peter Savaryn released his memoirs. There's a lot of rewritten speeches in there, some older material. There's also a very large photo section. And I had previously read in a few academic articles and heard here and there that Savaryn had awarded this degree to Charles. And so I began looking for copies of this photograph and to see if there's any documentation of it. I tracked down some archival sources, but the real breakthrough came when I acquired a copy of Savaryn's memoirs and saw just how politically connected he was. There's photos of him, of course, with King Charles, but also with Pope John Paul II, Desmond Tutu, Mother Teresa. The list goes on and on. And as well as those celebrities, he's also photographed with numerous Canadian politicians and numerous representatives of the British monarchy in Canada.
Some people watching this might think it's unreasonable to expect Charles could have known about Savaryn's Nazi past, but in your article you make it very clear that Britain's Foreign Office, who has a key role in planning royal visits abroad, had this extraordinary role immediately after World War II in actually helping to resettle Waffen-SS veterans in the West, in Britain and Canada, and that they compiled a list with many of their names on it. And so it is feasible that the Foreign Office could have known and perhaps should have alerted the palace before Charles received an award from this man.
If it wasn't for the British Foreign Office, Savaryn and the rest of his SS unit probably would have ended up in Soviet gulags, at the very least. We have seen the Foreign Office defend the 14th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division Galicia numerous times in the 1940s and 1950s to get them out of occupied Europe and get them into Britain and to get them into Canada and the US and Australia. Without the British Foreign Office, none of this would have happened in any way.
Can you tell us what the impact has been on Canadian politics more broadly of allowing people like Peter Savaryn and other Waffen-SS veterans to rise through society and gain prominent political roles? What impact has that had particularly on the left in Canada? So
the Canadian state has a long and violent history with the Canadian-Ukrainian left, particularly in the prairie provinces. In 1940, during the Soviet-Nazi Molotov-Ribbentrop peace pact, the Ukrainian Canadian communists ended up, of course, supporting the Stalinist line of trying to create peace in Europe. And because of that, they were suppressed by the Canadian state. Many of their union halls were taken and given over to right-wing Ukrainian groups, and many people were arrested and detained without any real charge. What we see in the post-war period is the state bringing in veterans of the Waffen-SS to Canada and really using those battle-hardened Nazi soldiers to suppress the labor movement in Canada, as well as the Canadian left-wing Ukrainian groups. Specifically, we see a campaign of violence in the immediate post-war period in Canada. We have bombings in Edmonton, and those grow until eventually we see front-page news bombings of Canadian-Ukrainian left-wing union halls on the front page of the Toronto newspaper. To get to that level of violence without anyone putting much into it is pretty indicative of state interaction with whoever's doing this. There's also been reporting in the Sudbury Star in the 1990s regarding the role of Waffen-SS veterans in strike breaking in mines owned by Inco. Much of the Canadian economy is mining based. Many of those mines are very critical to the American defense industry. And we know from reporting from very mainstream newspapers, local newspapers, that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did work with Waffen-SS veterans to suppress left-wing unions in Canada, particularly the mine mill union.
The first time I really noticed that Canada had this quite odd relationship with Ukraine's far right was a few years ago. There were stories about a neo-Nazi military unit in Ukraine that was being given training by Canada's military at a time when other NATO states were refusing to deal with those kind of units in Ukraine. Of course, many of those red lines have since dropped following Russia's invasion in 2022. But do you think, this deep history of collusion with Waffen-SS veterans is how Canada has been able to have such a kind of foreign policy on Ukraine that is so closely aligned with these far-right militias?
The Ukrainian Canadian diaspora was violently taken over by the far right, including veterans of the Waffen-SS, with the help of the Canadian government and with the help of parties like the Alberta Tories. And what we see is this alliance being made between mainstream political groups and a very large diaspora population to win elections. And once the Ukrainian far right got into government, Canadian foreign policy took a quite anti-Soviet turn, and that has continued to be a quite anti-Russian turn in the post-Cold War period. We've seen specifically training of units like the Azov Battalion and the Azov movement by the Canadian military in a way that you would not see, say, the Polish military do that. I think it was right after the Russians rolled over the border in Ukraine proper in their big invasion a couple of years ago. You had the premier of Alberta go give a large province-wide address where he donated a bunch of money from the state to a right-wing Ukrainian organization and simultaneously called for the construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline from the Alberta tar sands through the United States to the Gulf oil export terminals, just to combat the Russian oil economy and to try and help Ukraine. So there is very much an alliance in Canada between domestic right-wing organizations, mining companies, the security state, and the Ukrainian far right.
Hunter, thanks again for giving us this amazing exclusive. I know you're doing much more research into the role of the far right in North America. How can people follow you to keep track of the work that you're doing?
The best place that you can follow me is simply on Twitter. Just search my name, Hunter Pauly. It's quite easy. And as for what I'm working on next, I am trying to provide a proper documentation of this almost civil war within the Ukrainian Canadian community that has gone on for decades and decades, documented behind the scenes, but not so much in the public eye. And the role of that has to do with Canadian newspapers, local newspapers, and the Canadian state. And I'm hoping to shine a light on how all of these groups work together to really bury the truth about how the Waffen SS has influenced Canadian politics.